And I think we are right. Hello. Okay, so a bit later than planned. I am tonight having a stream with a guest of a slightly different political leaning to me, but an interesting guest nonetheless. This is JWille. Lovely to meet you, Jay. Lovely to see you. How are you tonight?
It's actually quite good. It's quite nice. I'm quite good actually. It's quite alright.
Excellent. It's an interesting one actually. Its weather is slowly where you are in the world, but where I am, the weather's slowly getting a bit warmer. Slowly, the days are getting a bit longer, and naturally, when there's more sun, I'm in a better mood. So all is well. So we're gonna we actually have a third guest who potentially will be joining us, but we thought we would just get started because it's the day goes on, right? So we've got a bit of a political casual chat tonight. It'd be nice to hopefully discuss a few things about the world and how it is at the moment. So I wanted to ask actually, Jay, just before we started, how would you say that the audience can sort of get a sense of where you are roughly? What would you say you would sort of put yourself in the place in the world?
Like geographically or ideologically?
I shouldn't make that clear. Ideologically, where would you say you're coming into this sort of discussion from? Would you say?
Oh, that makes sense. Like I'm generally I tend to be more of a right-leaning, politically speaking. But like I also think that but it's secondary to like in terms of priority to people I care about. Like I mainly care about people that are somewhat like me, if that makes sense. Like if somebody, for example, are of a sexuality minority, or have like the same or adjacent ethnicity to me, or like have a disability of some kind, I do care about that, and I do care about the rights of people. That is very important, and like then I want to have a free market economy like to go with it. But I am taking priorities, and that is that people will actually go ahead like any from ideological perspective. But I do want to use my political opinions in the service of people before. Like I think people is more important than ideology, but ideology can be quite useful. I do think that like politics is a tool, and the different tools are more appropriate in different circumstances.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because there's a lot in there that I can sort of agree with, right? Like I sort of, as easy as it is to sort of get funneled into, this is my ideology and this is what I want, it's sometimes action speaks a bit louder than words, right? Like it's important to do good in the world rather than to sort of be too adherent to some sort of theoretical principle.
Yes, that is true.
Yeah. And I suppose that's where a good place sort of to start, really, because the reason, one of the things that leapt out when sort of prompted me into sort of organizing this was a video that you shared, which ended up in my feed about LGBTQ, sort of related issues and topics. And the reason it sort of stuck out to me was because when I see and read and experience the current climate we're in, where there's a lot of negative sentiment from certain right-wing governments, very right-wing governments. The Trump administration leaps out at this as the most prominent one, but across the globe, you've got Putin's government in Russia. You've got various Eastern European countries leaning quite heavily into the anti-LGBTQ sentiment. Lots of countries in Africa have recently ramped up their criminalization. And so this video that I saw,
I posted in the private chat. You can share it in the comments.
Yes,
so that people know the video. If they're
so this is the video that I saw, which I'll post there. And it sort of jumped out at me because I sort of thought when we argue about sort of different people within the LGBTQ community and sort of grouping, and sort of suggest that some belong and some don't, it makes for a less, in my view, productive situation, given the threats that all within that section of society face from the wider political threat. Like, to me, because a lot of people take this position sort of semantically, right? Like, a lot of people sort of think, oh, well, let's think about what exactly each little bit of the LGBTQ populace is, and let's try and separate them, and let's say, well, it's only for us and it's only for certain sections. And I find that argumentation sort of misses the point a lot, that ultimately anyone who isn't heterosexual and deemed sort of normal by the powers that be is subject to otherness and subject to discrimination. And so everyone therefore deserves a place in the LGBTQ community that is not going to be viewed as normal. And so everyone in that community needs to be able to have the voice, to be able to say, yeah, I'm a person and my sexuality, gender, whatever, is as valid as anyone else's in society.
No, I do get what like you're coming from, and I do think that like my perspective, like the woman in the video that you're talking about, like my perspective, like even though I do agree with her conclusion, I don't come at it from like, I do have a not completely different but a varied perspective, and that is that I do care a lot about like people that are, well, from like a like biologically like defined minority group, should not like be victims of any form of like shouldn't be like subject to like state sanctioned discrimination. And I do think it's best for people to be understood, right? So like I actually very much like support the the rights of like transsexual people to be able to be transsexual and like do their transition thing, and I don't have a problem with that. I do have like an issue with like being likened to that, because like I have a sexual orientation minority, right? And I do believe that it's very bad to conflate transsexualism, which I think is valid and should have exist and does exist, like, and sexuality minority that are an unrelated thing that also is valid and exist. And I do believe that like that there need to be like a focus, like, or like many like advocacy groups or focus groups that are exclusively for sexuality minorities, and like that that is exclusive of people that aren't in these rigid sexuality minorities. Other people can of course be supportive, but if you are a different like condition like transsexualism, which is valid, and that is like something that stands on their own legs, and it's a separate issue, but it's not like an invalid issue. It's their own issue. But like we as a sexuality minorities have our own issues. So I do think that like when society is conflating sexuality minorities with transsexualism, and then people who claim to speak on behalf of transsexuals, even though they actually don't do that, then they get seen to be speaking for sexuality minorities, even though they're making sexuality minorities look very bad in the eyes of society. And I don't think transsexual people do that, because trans people are used to like normal people. But like many of the activist type do that, right? And I do think it's better for people to understand that you have transsexualism and you have sexuality minorities, but you can advocate for one without having it be connected to the other, because the connection is very artificial. And even if somebody might not care about one, only care about the other, then I don't think that either group should like lose that person as like an ally or like as a supporter. because like it's hard for people to accept package deals, and people have various perspectives. So therefore, I do think it's in the interest of sexuality minorities that we just get seen as sexuality minorities, rather than as LGBT, because I do find that grouping to be rather insulting and not very accurate.
Okay. So there's, I think, three things leap out at me with what you've just said. And to avoid sort of having a massive chunk of speech where I try and say all of it at once, I'll try and sort of separate it into three. I'm going to start with I think the first one, which is sort of a bit of a history, a bit of a sort of historically based argument. And so when, because you are, somewhat correct in that there is difference in what each letter of the LGBTQ is addressing. And there's overlap, and there's sort of similar but not quite exact definitions for all of them. But the reason they're all together is because of what they represent in regards to what was previously there in society. So humans exist, right? Humans are just, you imagine the first humans in the wilderness in caveman times, they're just there. And they're not thinking of labels and stuff for their behaviors. They're having sex, and they're sexual, and they exist throughout labels. And then you've got the existence of various civilizations and organizations, and they put labels onto things. You look at lots of societies in Europe, certainly, were Christian in the first millennium. You've got the introduction of Christ to the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, for instance. And that comes with ideology. So man and woman, and they produce child, and those children grow up into other men and women who have more children. And so because that is the taught ideology, those that don't fit into that structure of society, those who are categorized as men and those who are categorized as women, are seen as aberrant, are seen as not correct. So a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, do not fit this model, and so are taught as bad. And so then when this, after centuries of this being the norm, when people start saying, well, hang on a second, why is that right? Why is that wrong? There's nothing wrong with being gay. People who are gay, who have obviously been discriminated against, start organizing, they start coming together. And so when they're, if you look at the history of the 20th century, the sort of sexual movements and the civil rights movement and stuff for LGBTQ people starts coming to the forefront. At the same time as that, we have gender, and as you've just said, being transgender is a fairly, is just part of society, right? Someone who realizes that the gender they are assigned at birth is not what they are. Perhaps they're called. The doctor has said, "Oh, this is a boy," and they say, "Well, actually, no, I'm not. That isn't accurate to who I am." But that conflicts with the same ideology that we've just spoken about, right? If someone if various groups have said, well, gender is something that's firmed and you've got an inherent one and you've got to stick with it forever, they are opposing it on the same ideological basis that they've opposed the gay person. And so it became necessary for, and logical and natural that these groups of people organize together, because they are all essentially being opposed for the same similar reasons. And so that is why, even though there is difference between someone who's gay is not necessarily the same as someone who is transgender, like obviously they're different things, but they're grouped together because when you face societal discrimination, that naturally brings people under the same umbrella sort of terms.
Oh yeah, I do get why people want to do that, but I do think that in order to protect I do think that basically me is that I do actually think that both are have been I guess discriminated against socially, because people were, because a lot of things weren't very well understood back then, right? But now when people have better knowledge, I do think that the utility of having these two different groups categorized in the same way, it actually causes more of a issue with actually advocating for them, in my opinion, because it is for advocacy for people who are gay or people who are lesbian, right? It's very important for us, right, that the same sex attracted, which is homosexuality, has a very rigid and clear definition in words, and that is that like you are basically like you are a male that are into other males, or you're female or into other female, right? And therefore it's not really very like productive to have transitioning being like, because that's not really like something that is like very like, it's not something that belongs in the advocacy for the rights of homosexuals, because like that would like go away from the very rigid definition of what homosexuality is, and those it's very important to keep that rigid in order to actually make sure that gay and lesbian can actually have the right to like their, because like, but frank meaning is that if you are gay, you don't like the opposite like sex, you don't want vagina, and if you're lesbian, you don't want a dick, and means you cannot like physically reproduce with your own partner, which means that you have to do advocacy for so that you can have the alternative means of having family the way you want to, and that should be available. So you need to put focus on that, and you need to make sure that you can get married to the same sex.
Okay.
I do think the same is for right. So I don't think the transsexuals are like invalid or anything, but I do think that like it's not very productive to have that in the advocacy for gay people, if that makes sense.
Well, I can see where you're coming from, but before we engage with some of the stuff you said there, can you see why it would still be useful for LGBTQ people to all organize together? Because the person that says no, two men can't get married, is the same person that's also saying no, this person cannot transition. Like
not always.
The same. Well, a lot of the time. I mean, I think the reason I sort of see this as quite an issue is because if you look at who in government right now is trying to deconstruct the rights of transgender people, they're the same people that blocked and opposed gay marriage, blocked and opposed civil unions, all the things that have been fought and won for, they've always opposed. So the reason these groups organize together is because they are in the same crosshairs of the same people, right? Like they're when they remove transgender rights, as they're currently trying to do across America at the moment, they'll do the same thing to gay rights and to lesbian rights and stuff. Like it's a joint effort.
But that's kind of like the point why it's not considered in the same category, because like that means that people are just going to use the fact that they assume it's connected as an underlying to oppose other things, and therefore I also like if somebody's attacking another group of people, transsexuals, I think it's best for us people to like I don't want to like help them as somebody who is LGBT. I want to help them as somebody who supports transsexuals. Like then I'm an outsider supporting transsexuals, because I do think that they are should also like would benefit a lot from their own advocacy groups, not just because like actually many people are not only who are in my opinion rather anti-trans. A significant portion of them tend to sometimes be homosexual in some aspects, and of course I don't agree with them being anti-trans. I do think that it's very like it's not very fair to like not to transsexuals either to make sure that they group together, because that's just going to lead to because many of the gay and lesbian people aren't actually they're allies, and whenever some people that are gay or lesbian, you always get told that they are the same or adjacent to people who are trans, we can get very pissy, and that can actually like cause people to become less accepting within the gay community and lesbian community. and that's not something that I think that I don't think transsexuals like deserve that. I think they should just be accepted, like, and stand on their own terms, and they can have allies, and allies can be any sexual orientation.
Well, indeed, right? Anyone can be a. Sorry, you go ahead. So we're going to finish that. Sorry.
Like, and I do think that when it comes to gay people, like, it's also like not really specifically our fight. I do think that, like, if somebody, for example, remove like trans from LGB, then to me, I actually think that, like, doing me a favor, because to me, me and many other gay and lesbian people find being groped as LGBT to be rather insulting. I do, because you're telling that wanting to be attracted to your own sex means one is adjacent to not to wanting to become the opposite sex, and that could actually feel a little bit like also insulting to me. So therefore, a lot of people, another thing that people seem to forget is that I do think that LGBT, having an LGBT movement is kind of acceptable, but I don't think a person is LGBT. I think you are a sexual minority or you're transsexual. But if a movement want to care about both groups, well, they can call themselves LGBT movement, but that's a movement, not a demographic. Doesn't mean.
I mean, it's an umbrella term, isn't it? Like, it's always, you could always zoom in more and see what each person is within the umbrella, but it's an umbrella to sort of categorize people who don't fit pre-existing stuff. But to rewind for a second, and I wanted to spotlight this comment that I've seen in the chat, and I think it's quite an important one. One of the reasons that it's like you said a second ago that they're sort of separate issues and they're not necessarily of the same thing, and you wouldn't want to have it all grouped together. And I think part of that is because different groups within LGBTQ are at different stages of social acceptance. The reason that transgender issues are spotlighted now is because more work has successfully been done to manage to gain gay rights and stuff in common society, right? Like, you will see in a TV show a gay character far more frequently than you will see a transgender character. There are lots and lots of openly gay politicians, more compared, well, obviously not lots and lots, but more compared to there were 20, 30, 40 years ago. There's very few transgender politicians, and the ones that are still treated quite terribly, even as they are transgender, in their various state legislators and stuff. And so because of this, it's necessary for people within similar walks of life, because obviously, whilst you're quite right, someone who is gay is not the same as someone who is transgender, but these things are fluid and overlap, and there's not like you said a second ago that they're quite rigid, and I would actually dispute that. I don't think that, even though one person may have a rigid interpretation of a term, they are ultimately just words you've come up with to describe something in life, right? And life isn't rigid. Life is full of fluidity and various things. And whilst it's important to have a rough understanding of what it is, to say categorically this word means this exact thing and there's no deviance from it in law, I feel may lead to and would lead to some issues. The reason that these groups so naturally sort of group together is because society has created a set of rigid rules that these people fell outside of, and they needed to organize together to gain social recognition. Hence, LGBTQ movements being so united and together to gain those social rights. I mean, I think the danger of separating T from LGB is what we're seeing now, that transgender issues become a quick target for bigots and a stepping stone to then breaking down further rights. Like, for instance, in lots of southern states in America that have managed to remove pride flags from being displayed and stuff, and have taken all mention of LGBTQ groups in schools out of discussion whatsoever.
Like, it's gonna be much easier I'm just going to explain rather than to reply to all the statement. It'd be easy if I just reply to the thing that stood out the most. Is that okay?
Yeah. Go for it.
Like, basically what I believe in that instance, I actually, as being gay, and I will have kids, right? I will have either going to, it's like two ways I'm gonna have kids, right? It's either going to be my biological kids or the biological kids of my future partner, right? One of us is going to be the one having kids, and the kids are going to like be raised by us together, right? That's how we're gonna have babies, right? And I actually don't want any mention of LGBT as a terminology, right, to be mentioned in the school to my children, because whatever, if we and I might not agree on like if we should call something LGBT or if we should call it LGB or something like that, that's fine. But like, I don't like when school take like, I don't want to be called LGBT by kids to like to say that, like, if they go to school, right, and they people know how they have gay parents, right, and then the people say in the school LGBT, and if they mention to these kids when they're young, right, and then tell like the classmates of my kids when I have kids, that your parents are just like people who wants to become the opposite sex or anything else that people call trans when it's not, then I think that's just going to be that's actually, like, to me it would be a lot like targeted bullying of kids that come from gay families. So I do think
can you see that that's the that's not the fault of the said sexual minorities? That's
no,
the fault
it's not. It's education system. So I do think that if you're going to teach about sexual orientation, like if you think that having an LGBT movement is lucrative, like that's one thing. But like if you're going to teach about sexual orientation, you should teach it as its own thing. You shouldn't teach it as in connection to anything that's not a sexual orientation. You can teach like any other things too, but I do think that like sexual orientation shouldn't be taught alongside trans issues. Like you can still teach it if you want to, actually don't really care. But I do think that teaching sexual orientation is something that should be done by itself, and people should not call the parents of any kids in school LGBT, because that's, but in my families that I will have would actually not reflect the family. It would actually just be a form of stereotyping, and it would be rather it would be like rather hurtful for my it could be rather hurtful for my children, and I don't want that. So to me, I would actually prefer to go to school where they don't talk about that topic like at all, actually.
So is it just the label LGBT that is the issue? So like you wouldn't see, you're not opposed to them, like you imagine a hypothetical, the teacher's like, okay, people have relationships with all different makeups. Most people in society are heterosexual. However, there's also gay relationships, lesbian relationships. Some people are XYZ and so on.
No, I don't have a problem with that. That's actually
it's just the actual.
It's just the actual label that I don't want to be.
Okay, but then it is what is your issue with the label then? Because ultimately, I think the label only exists as like an umbrella term, right? Because as you've said, there's lots of different people in the world with different places within this umbrella. It's like to save time almost. It's just.
Oh, I don't think it should be taught separately, because I don't actually see it even as an umbrella term. I see LGBT movement or advocacy group, LGBT groups, not as umbrella term. I see them as two very different groups that just join together out of convenience or out of utility. I don't think that there is like an LGBT population or umbrella term that exists like demographically. I just think it's like could be used as a group of an advocacy, as a utility.
Okay, well, yeah, like in an ideal world, yes. Like if we hadn't had the society with discrimination and sort of cis heteronormativity and big efforts You know, you can still hear me. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I still hear you.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, if we had existed in a society that didn't have centuries of executing people for being gay and stuff, then I agree. Like, you wouldn't have the need for labels, because people would just be like, oh, okay, well, that's part of life. It's like it's as normal as having brown hair or being 6'6" and not 5'9" or whatever. Like,
I actually want homosexuality to be just like that, and I
exactly.
think that finish.
I was going to say, the reason it's not like the reason that the label exists is because before the label, it was classified as like mental disorders, and they were killed and locked away and stuff. Like, the reason there's an umbrella term is because they had to organize together. And so whilst in society there's still that negative anti gay, anti-transgender, etc. force, there needs to be that movement. That's why it exists, and that's why it's sort of taught in that manner, because there's active forces in society that still operate against it. Does that make sense? Like, can you sort of see?
I do see where you're coming from, but what I do see is that like many people use the association of LGBT and what it's like they regard as being the trans movement as a excuse to convince other people to be homophobic. And I want to be, and if I want to take away my opponents the ability of doing that, so therefore, in order to say that, look, homosexuality is sexual orientation, it's not related to transsexualism, they are fine, but they're not me. So I don't want people to like use them as a tool to get to me, which people are using actually.
But that's people who use. Oh, you go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Right, and I want to make sure that they can't. I want to like say like, no, we're not LGBT, we're just gay, because like that association it's not like it's an artificial one. So I don't.
The reason the person that goes after you because they like if someone says, oh, you're LGBT, so I'm going after you, like that it would, meaning no offense, that person will also go after you because you're gay. Like the reason, it's almost like strength in numbers, right? Like I get what you're saying. Like, someone who is gay and attracted to men is not, like, the argument wouldn't make sense if it was like, oh, they are now trans. Like, they're not. It's not the same thing. But because of the social factors that have led to people opposing gay people, transgender people, or all people in that section, that's why the movement exists. I feel like we're not even really disagreeing as such with the actual like things. It's more like a terminology thing.
Like it's mainly a terminology thing. That's like the main objections I have to that it I just find it a very like an insulting terminology when it comes to, because look, like because like homosexuality is not like gay is not really a label. It is a label because it's descriptive, but it does really like homosexuality exists in nature. It has existed long before any human language could describe it. Like like for example, you see it in all throughout the animal kingdom, right?
Yeah,
that is like a real like physical thing. It's just the term gay is it's just a word. It describes a physical. It describes homosexuality, and then the term lesbian describes specifically a homosexual female. Like a lesbian doesn't even have to be like a woman, right? Like, for example, other animals can also be lesbians if they are female and homosexual. And the same thing goes for like gay. You can have a gay like hound. You can have like a gay swine or a gay whale or a gay like bird, right? You can have a lesbian like sow, a lesbian like whale, lesbian bird too. Like it just exists in nature. Like you probably won't notice it that much because like, but you don't really notice in human that much either, unless you're like, because it usually doesn't come up, like at least doesn't do for me. But it's still it's just like a part of like of the animal nature that homosexuality exists, and that very much exists outside of any form of like society or any form of language or any label. and so therefore, I don't really think that construction additional labels around it to linking it to other things that also exist and are valid in their own right, but I don't see that as being like that's not really accurate. It's mainly just like a social construct is just like a what people say in society. So therefore, or as an ideological position. And now you say like, well, I don't really agree with that. So therefore, I'm not going to like use that label LGBT to identify myself and other gay people. Sexuality minorities is also just like a biological term. It's like you have sexual orientation, which does exist in many animals, including humans. So like, which are the majority sexual orientation in humans is heterosexuality. That means that a minority is going to be homosexual, bisexual, asexual. Sexuality minority. It's like a very, those things are very rigid. Like, and I do think that's good because that is because many think about it's good. It's also because there are laws that are protecting people, homosexuals, from like discrimination, and it should be, even when there aren't, it should be, and therefore we need to have a very rigid definition so that people cannot get around that and then discriminate against people who are gay or lesbian.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I agree with that bit. There definitely needs to be nice, clear laws in place. However, I think it's interesting because I do agree that you need to have definitions. Like, given the system we have right at this moment, yes, I agree. There should be definitions in place. I think the interesting bit for me is that you said quite correctly that long before humans made words, there was gay activity, right? Like as you said, go to a natural park, safari park, whatever, you will see many animals engaging in sexual activity, regardless of what anatomical parts they have. And I think that is sort of where the next bit comes, where you say that in humans, sexualities are rigid. There's rigid definitions. I actually think what you said a second ago about how humans have made words for these things is why you're seeing it as rigid as such. Because I do agree there are definitions that largely fit these terms, but they themselves are also produced by humans to describe things, and so are naturally going to have areas that aren't necessarily always the case. But it comes away from what I'm sort of more saying here, which is less about what the exact definition is and more that regardless of the various things in society, if we want to get to a point where a person isn't needing to have a label and they can just be like, oh yes, I'm here, I am with my partner who is a man, here's my family, and that's just the end of it, and they're just sort of normally accepted and stuff, and there's no, in the same way that if you met someone who was left-handed, you wouldn't be like, oh, you're left-handed. Like, you would just think, oh, it's just a person in society. Like, if we go back in time, left-handed people used to have their arms tied behind their back when we were at school, and they had to be forced to use their right hand. Like, we would think that's abhorrent now, but a long time ago, well, not even that long ago, actually, a few generations ago, that was the norm. And so for us to be able to get to the point where, as you say, you have your partner and you just get on in life and there's no need for any sort of categorization, as this comment from the same person actually has just said, we have to get rid of the anti various groups attitudes to be able to get that. And so the whole point of there being the reason that there is the sort of LGBTQ movement and categorization, and the reason it's all sort of grouped together is because and I again point to the sort of existential threat for it. There's a big crosshair on everyone in that category for the same reason, which is that the domineering forces in society of a right-wing sort of conservative persuasion have campaigned and been activists against it for a very long time. And that's why it's all sort of grouped together. And I think that ultimately has to be addressed before we can start thinking, oh, well, let's get to a post-LGBTQ point, if that makes sense.
like, I don't really agree that it's just conservatives being anti-trans, anti-gay. I would actually say that like a lot of like the people that are very anti like trans are actually themselves gay or lesbian, and many people who are actually very homophobic are many of the trans activist type.
Well, you can definitely be conservative and gay. You can be
No, of course, but many people who are anti-trans from the gay or lesbian perspective doesn't have to be aren't always conservative, and many people who are anti-gay from the trans perspective aren't not always conservative either. Like, of course, both.
Yeah, no, I agree. Definitely, I agree.
Right. So therefore, like, it doesn't serve either group to be grouped together, because many of the other group are actually like not very accepting of their other group, and it feels a bit weird to just target specifically the homosexual, gay and lesbian community of being trans accepting. It seems that they are the ones that needs to be accepted first, and not society, which I think is rather like in the wrong direction. I think it's much easier. I think it's actually because transsexualism is actually something that is actually more palatable or easier to understand, actually, from the average person in society than specifically gay or lesbians. Because like, if you, like, I don't know if this for everybody feels gay, but many people who are gay or lesbian, we have a personal like maybe not like aversion, but like discomfort with like trans in a small extent, like not a bigoted one. What I mean by that is that if you are gay, like that means you're attracted to men, right?
Yeah.
If you, for example, right, see a man like becoming a woman, like from perspective of someone who's gay, it is like kind of like, from my perspective, feels like I think you should be allowed to transition, but it's something that's very uncomfortable for a lot of gay men to see, because we like love our own sex, and to like, you know, see somebody go from male to female and then living in a straight passing relationship seems it's actually quite. I'm not against people doing it. It's their choice. No, it's not their choice. It's like, you're trans if you're trans. Like, it's not your choice. But it's just a very like something. It's not something that's very digestible for homosexuals compared to how it is for average people. That are mainly straight. And the same thing goes for the other way. If you basically see someone who used to be female transitioning to a male, most androsexual trans guys are not like this. They don't expect gay men to like have sex with them, but like, because if you're gay, you don't actually want to have sex with somebody who has a vagina. And it's actually, I think, a little bit more for the lesbian like position. Is like, of course, the same label is if you see some woman transforming into a man, you would see it very uncomfortable, because now you go for someone who could be gay or lesbian in this instance, becoming in a straight passing relationship instead, which is like, you know, it's not a choice, but just transsexualism is very different. But also, like, if you are a lesbian, you don't, like, as a straight guy, you don't want dick if you're a lesbian or if you're a straight man. Like, so therefore, it's very, and I do think it's very important for lesbians to be able to say we don't want dick. And most trans women, they don't expect lesbian to take dick, right? They absolutely don't. But when there's some people who do, that can be quite problematic for the lesbian population, because it seems that either way, basically what it looks like, what it feels like from many gay people, is that trans seems to be a way of like, it seems to be very like, in a weird way, like posing its heteronormativity in the gay, on like people who are gay or lesbian. So therefore, like, I do think transsexualism is valid, but it's much more comfortable if they get to have their own like community in their own group, which they are allowed to have more so than people who are gay or lesbian. And because then they don't have to, you know, feel like they are being invalidated, and we don't have to feel like we're being invalidated either.
But it is that
that's something that I feel very strongly about, I suppose.
now that speaks to the social pressures, which I think what that ending thing you said about how you know feeling validated and invalidated, which I think is important. I think that we can root that in the wider social pressures. You can imagine, and this is something that is still sort of spoken about. A lot of bigoted people say, "Oh, well, it's just a phase. It's just something they're saying. They're not really gay, lesbian, whatever. It's just something that they've just believed." And so, when as the scenario you came up with, you said a second ago, a gay man sees a man, and that man has then transitioned into a woman. They're now transgender, and they think, "Oh, what does that mean?" In a non-bigoted society in which there is no existing homophobic, anti-LGBTQ normal ideas, that's just like, okay, that's just a different person. I can go about my life with no, it doesn't have any bearing on me. But because we live in a society in which people have claimed gay people are faking it, people have claimed that trans people are faking it, people make all sorts of horrible lies, that unfortunately plays on the mind of people in society, and so has an influence in putting bigoted ideas into the average mind. So use an analogy, racism, even though someone might not be like a devout KKK member themselves, when you have lots of stories about Black people being thuggish and angry and hostile, it can create racist thoughts in your mind, or thoughts of a racial nature in your mind, without you necessarily actively believing it, which can make you then perceive things somewhat differently. So in the same way that you can internalize racist ideas through a racist society, a society with a history of anti-gay, lesbian, etc. thoughts have a similar thought. If we think about it though, a person being transgender has no, you said yourself, right? There's no, someone being transgender and someone being gay are not conflicting things. Someone can be attracted to men and the trans person can exist. Like the two aren't incompatible. I think the idea that as well, there were a few assumptions I feel in what you said, because where it's absolutely true that some people are going to have a stronger idea in their mind of what they are attracted to, but these labels are socially produced, they're fluid. And so because everyone's got a different interpretation and sexuality and understanding of themselves, the reason it's a bit more fluid is precisely to mirror that. There's no, what one person sees as a man is going to be very different to another. And so to say, like the reason it's not as easy as just saying this is our rigid fixed thing, is because it wouldn't reflect the wide variety of people in society. And then I'll save my point about activism and stuff for in a second, because I wanted to come on to that, but I'll let you respond to what I've just said.
I would basically just want to say that sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. I would just say that basically homosexuality is very rigid, and that is that if you are gay or if you're lesbian, that there is a very rigid sexual label. And I don't think that that transsexuals existing itself disrupts that, but it is also not really easy to it's a little bit harder to, it can be sometimes be kind of hard to coincide, because if you basically say that, oh, but what if you transition, does that mean that you're now does that mean you're now can transition into becoming gay or becoming lesbian? I will say, and then I would say no, and then many people say that, well, you can, and then homosexuality's rigid definition becomes disrupted, and that is not good for the protection of the rights of gays and lesbians, and also for the acceptance, because it feels like we don't, it seems that we are I think everybody should accept transsexuals, of course, but I think that we are being taught to accept transsexual in people who are gay and lesbian more so, but it doesn't seem to be like reciprocated. Like we never see like people gonna say that we're not expecting trans people to accept that the homosexual, gay and lesbian aren't just labels that you can like choose. That those are very rigid and you can't really get into it. So yeah, that's what I think.
I mean, I don't think that. I mean, I think if you look at polls, I think trans people and all LGBTQ people on the whole are very accepting of each other as a whole, right? Like, for as much as you get some people who are very loud on social media, on the whole, you go to like a pride parade and people of all walks of the community are going to be, like around each other having a nice time, right? Like, there's generally speaking, if you have accepted the idea that there are gay people, if there are trans people, you're also probably going to accept that there are gay people, and you're going to be fine with all that sort of stuff. To come back to the idea of rigidness, I feel like I sort of agree and disagree, because I agree that it's a gay person, a man who is attracted to another man, a man who wants to have a relationship with another man, right? Like, that is it's rigid in the sense that it has a definition, but it's like man is a social construct, right? It's not like it's something. I mean, but it is, isn't it? Like, for as much as like we can point to things which we would all sort of associate with men, they are ultimately things we have just decided. And yes, you're right. It does. You said a second ago that if someone there is that worry that people would make the argument that being gay is a choice. But I would say two things to that. I would say, firstly, that argument is always made by bad faith people, right? It's always
and by people who don't know.
Exactly, right? People who have a clear agenda of trying to attack, like you said, destroy LGBTQ rights, destroy gay rights, destroy the rights of people to be able to be themselves in society. But I would also say, secondly, to that the reason it's contentious is for that exact reason, because there's that threat to protections for various groups. If that threat wasn't there, and one day someone said, actually, I would like to try being attracted to men, like, if that, like, that wouldn't, to me, I've always thought that there's not, so if someone wanted to choose to be gay, like, which, whether or not they could or not is another discussion. But if someone said to themselves, even though
they want to try,
yeah, exactly, if they wanted to try, that's not a bad thing. So
no, sorry.
So like the whole, I think because we live in a society that literally criminalized these activities not very long ago, and unfortunately is still criminalizing them in many areas of the world, it makes discussion around the debate tricky, right? Like, it makes it hard to have an honest discussion about anything with it, because of the way it's, because of the tentative way we've had to slowly edge it through. But ultimately, someone being gay and someone being transgender aren't things which are are threats to each other. The threat comes from elsewhere.
Usually, no, actually, not being trans itself is not a threat, but many of the trans activist groups are like a threat, because
in what way?
Because what a lot they're doing is basically reflecting very poorly on what people see as LGBT. So therefore, if they're acting or doing certain things that are not in any way associated with gay people at all, and then people see it and they don't like it, and then they think that, oh, this is how gay people are, and then see that and then they become homophobic for that reason. And if people didn't have the idea of LGBT as being connected in their mind, which were put there artificially because it's not it's a created label, right? Then that would actually shield people that would actually not funnel people to become homophobes. I think that and also many of the trans activists, right? Not trans people, because trans people from all walks, they can have any opinion. There's not an ideologically unified group or enemies. But many of the trans activists are actually rather homophobic when they are trying to dispute the definition of or the rigidness of what homosexuality means. Like if you say that for example, a lesbian don't want dick. So whenever someone says that you can be a lesbian and want dick, you can't. And there's many trans activists have said that. And
is
not
that
just that. Yeah, I don't think that's representative of trans people, but I do think that is a type of homophobia that comes from the trans activist crowd. And also, like, two men can't have a baby together. That means if somebody says that, well, if you're trans, then you can. I'm like, well, no. And
can you see though that there's two assumptions in both of those hypotheticals though? The first
it's
one,
not really hypothetical. It's kind of like I've seen it in.
So a lesbian. I mean, firstly, I would love to know which trans rights groups you're sort of thinking about. But,
I don't think about any group. I think about what I've heard individuals say.
Okay, but let's focus on those two sort of points then. So, firstly, a lesbian and their genital preferences. So, genital preferences are unique to every single individual, right? No two people are like perfect clones in terms of what they are attracted to. And so when we think about genitalia, they are also something which have had social meanings put onto them, right? Whilst they have, of course, an anatomical purpose, the gender and the labels we put onto them based on their gender are ultimately also constructed, right? Because ultimately, as you said at the start, the person, the human being, the physical organization of cells and matter existed before the labels we created to identify them existed. And so, yes, you're absolutely right that if you were to do a straw poll, perhaps most people that fit our general understandings of gay, straight, lesbian, etc., would also meet general assumptions around genitalia. But they are not fixed rules. They're expressions that are heavily based in the societies that produced them. And so some transgender people will have said, actually, genital preferences and sexuality are a little bit less directly analogous than what some people have claimed. And I think, again, it's important to remember that because of the rampant discrimination that exists in society, the things that certain people say, like, for instance, a transgender person trying to make it easier for transgender people to, get things in society, is going to be taken out of context, clipped out of context, made to be much worse than it is. And the second example, the two men and them having a baby. Man, again, is a social construct. I know this person in the chat here has said that man is not a social construct. But then the definition they've given, adult, human, male, all three of those words, adult, human, and male, are also constructed, right? They're also words that we have produced and assigned meaning to. They're also, they're things that we have created. And yes, they refer to things that, generally speaking, you'd be able to categorize fairly well. But ultimately, they are all subjective. And when you scrutinize them, they're not quite as binary as certain people in society would imply. And so you could have a situation where man 1 has a penis, man 2 is a transgender man, and so has the anatomical parts that enable them to grow a child in their womb. And lo and behold, 9 months pass and 2 men have a baby. And yes, the biological parts are different to have produced this baby, but man is a social category, and so 2 men have produced this. But like, if you someone walks past and they've got that, you walk past someone and they're wearing clothes and they're wearing the sort of apparel that you would sort of socially see them as a man with. Like, to me, who's going to be fussed as to what happens inside their body? Like, ultimately, how we exist is through our sociality and our social connections, and so socially, that person is a man. And so that's what is being spoken about when we talk about, when people have spoken about, the sort of need to be a bit more flexible with sort of things. And if we really think about it, there's not any threat to look. The threat in a statement there isn't there. It comes from other external groups that have weaponized certain phrases and turned it into hotly contested stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do know what you mean, but I don't agree. Like, I am very like, to me, like, I actually think that terms like men and women are not, and even trans actually are not social categories. I think they are very, like, not they're biological categories. Like, that like describe is a sex taxonomy and a condition, right? Like the term man describes the adult human stage of a adult male stage of a human. Just like a swine is the same for a pig, adult male, and a bull is an adult male cattle, and a rooster is an adult male chicken, and a stallion is an adult male horse. And
all nouns.
So the ideas are a very biological category. So like from biology rule, a trans man doesn't fit the label of man, but that's fine because a trans man is a trans man is a female who transitioned to present as a male and are referred to by male pronouns, right? So he doesn't actually fit the label of man in the biological sense. So therefore, a trans man being with a man is a biological woman, right? Being with a man, so that doesn't.
But why though? But like what you say a biological sense, but why? Like what? In what sense?
Because he's a female. He's a trans.
Yeah, but why? Like, what's the? Do you understand? Like, what my question is then? Why has that been? You know, why is that the case?
I mean, like, that's the definition of a female.
But according to what? Like, what is the definition
of a female?
Yeah, like what? You said that the trans man is biologically a female. I'm asking why that is the case. Like, what is the basis of this definition?
A female would be the sex that produce gametes that can be fertilized.
But why? Because that
that's like you have two sexes. One sex produces big gametes that can be fertilized by smaller ones. That's the female. A male produces small gametes that can fertilize. Yeah, that's
sperm cells and egg cells.
Yeah, that's what defines a male and a female.
But if it is that quite accurate though, because that definition ignores quite a large amount of a non-irrelevant portion of a population have been discounted from malehood and masculinity and femininity, male and female, have been excluded based on the definition you've just given. Like, that is a fine definition for like a simplified in understanding, right? Like, that fits a lot of people. Completely accept that as like a general rule. However, that doesn't fit everyone, that definition. And I think this is what the so-called activist groups are trying to make a point of, right? That if you actually look at the human population, there's a lot of people with different characteristics, be it slightly different chromosome pairing, slightly different productions of hormones, various different structures in their bodies, which don't fit the sort of typical categorization. And obviously, more importantly, humans are social animals. And so to say blanketly, you are either A or B, you are either X or Y, you are male or female, and you can't change that. That is something that we've socially produced. We've created those labels. Whatever biological processes lead to the creation of new life are independent from the social reality that we live in. Because if we were to truly organize our society based on biological things happening in our body, it would be a mess, right? Like, it wouldn't. Can you imagine, for instance, if you went to like a job interview and they said to you, "What are your chromosomes?" And you would say, "Oh, it's probably XY," and they're like, "Well, prove it." And then you have to, you're like, "Well, how am I going to prove that? I have to go to the doctor, I have to get a test done." It would just be a pain, right? Like it would be a silly way to organize society. And so transgender people, or people who've made aware, like try to raise the awareness of this, which includes just like scientists, right? People who look at the body and want to understand it in a way more complex than basic stuff. Essentially, all they said is, we shouldn't be as fixated on antiquated ideas about biology because it's a bit more complex. And so all that means is, if transgender people say, actually, I don't think this label fits me, just vie la vie, que sera sera, let them be, right?
I mean, like, you can't really like say what label fits and doesn't fit you. Like, if like you don't have to use it, but if I basically have an understanding of a word or a label, and that is very internally consistent with me, and I use it to describe things that I see in reality, then he or she does fit the label. Like, basically, like, trans men are female. Like, I don't think there's anything bad with being female. I just think that while he's a female who transitioned to present as though he was a male, so therefore I'm gonna address him as a he. That's the social aspect of how I address him as a he, but like, he's still female, even though he looks like a guy. Like, not a lot of guys, okay, maybe not a lot, because very few, not many trans people that you meet daily, but actually quite a few actually who are trans. They're trans. I accept him as trans. I accept him as, like, I call him he, but he's still going to be female. Like, he still has like the uterus and like the set mark for gamete production, X chromosome over.
Okay, well, it's great that you accept the trans person as what they say they are, right? But the two sort of different things is that, firstly, you still have assigned, like you say, right, like the uterus and stuff. They exist, as you said at the start. These things existed in people's bodies before the labels that I've been assigned to them since, right? Like the first biology textbook that said what you're saying now, that people who have these things are female, was made after, long after humans existing, just as they were, right? And actually, books like people who interpreted religious books like the Bible and stuff to then say society is man and woman, it also existed before the creation of those biological textbooks and influenced the people who wrote those biological textbooks. But then secondly, the reason it's important is because whilst you and I are able to, if we met a trans person as we have, we would just be like, oh, what's your name? Oh, I'm John. I'm a trans man. We're not going to suddenly be like, oh, well, you're secretly a woman. Oh, I'm not going to call you John. You're actually called someone else. Like, you would just call them John, right? There are lots of people in society who, as you've just said, think, oh, that trans person is not who they say they are, and work tirelessly to try and stop them from being able to live their life. We're seeing in America at the moment, trans people can't get their passports printed properly. They can't access lots of things. Their healthcare has been cut off. They're not allowed to do the things that we would take for granted, just like using a toilet or going in certain spaces, playing sport. There's lots of things that are being weaponized against trans people at the moment, which is why it's quite important to unpack the normalized transphobia and anti-trans sentiment in a lot of our daily practices. And so I think that is the other thing. When we talk about activists, we have to be careful, because a lot of the time the so-called activist is just like, I don't know, a trans person who has said, actually, I am trans, and it's not a big thing. Like, because of the way activist is often used as a pejorative, it turns a lot of conversations into supposed activism, because the person is having to defend themselves. They're having to say, well, no, I'm not a liar. I am just a normal trans person. And that's why I think there's a lot of natural defensiveness, because of course there's defensiveness. They're being attacked. So it's important to move beyond almost the sort of hysteria and look at what's actually happening, which is that ultimately trans people just want to live their lives, and we've got to stop people who are opposing trans people and any other LGBTQ person, any other person in that branch.
No, I get what you're saying, but like what they're doing when they are basically trying to, like what I described earlier was that then they are disputing the very rigid definition of homosexuality. Like they can just like stay out of the label homosexuality and just like be a trans couple. Like you're dating someone who's trans. Yeah, you don't really fit the couple of the qualify of homosexual, but you still like a couple. Like you are valid. You are your own. You are your other thing, your other category. But like so, therefore, why is such an insistence to be called to be say that two men can have kids when they don't? And one of the very different important thing for gay people to be able to have the access to have kids is that we need to say that we are gay with two males. We can't have a baby together. Therefore, we need to have laws around that makes it possible so that we can have kids and be recognized as the parents, like regardless. And therefore, that is important to us. And that is no way like disputing a androsexual couples, because that's a good label you can use. If you are a trans guy who's dating a guy, both are interested into male presenting individuals, so they're androsexual. It's an androsexual couple. They can have kids. A gay couple, we cannot. So just like now we have descriptive language that describes things, and I think it's important to protect that, to protect gay people. And I think it's very, and I don't think trans people, like actually that I'm pretty sure, don't have a problem with these labels, these different labels. It's just that the insistence of wanting to be in the category of gay or wanting to be in the category of lesbian, when you don't fit the biological requirement for that, that is what a lot of gay and lesbian people have a problem with, and why we don't want the LGBT label. It would be much easier for trans people in general and trans activists to live their life if they weren't would be left attached to us. Like it just complicates things. And I think that like you know what I'm saying, at least.
Like okay, I can see, you know, I see. Okay, let's hypothetical then. We now live. You wake up tomorrow. It's an absolute utopia. Every single bigot on the planet has vanished. Like they've just they're gone for every reason. Every single person on the planet is 100% accepting. They don't even think. In fact, it's so they don't even think about it. Like there's no literally being gay or transgender or whatever is as normal and accepted as wearing glasses or preferring to wear shorts instead of trousers. Like it's literally not bats an eyelid. Family moves in across the road from you. It's two men. You have a conversation. You're just chatting. One of the guys says, "Oh, by the way, my husband's pregnant. So we're going to be having a lot of baby stuff brought in. He's a trans man. He's pregnant." How does that like?
It's fine, but they don't fit the label of homosexual. They are another.
But they say to you, "Oh, we're a gay couple. My partner's going to have a baby." How in what way does that challenge you? Like, no, in what way is that?
Because they aren't like, because gay is very like, it's a very biological term. They don't fit that. Okay, I do get that, like, if they go to people and people don't know that he's trans, then sure you might say that, because like just explain to everybody you're trans everywhere. It's not like something that you might want to do because they're kind of annoying. But so therefore you might just say that. But if you're gonna say that your partner is pregnant, then you're kind of saying that you are not gay. So why do you want the label gay?
Can you see that that's in part because we in our society we so associate pregnancy is for women, right? That's the norm in society. Like you associate motherhood, having kids, birth, that's all coded as female. That isn't the same thing as it inherently being something that only people with the label woman can do. Like for as much, and that's not, people who say that aren't trying to erase, like, I feel like that's the hang up, right? The worry is that people are you're going to lose your status. You're going to lose the label, and it's going to be seen as just like a token trivial thing.
Also, potential losing rights and protection.
Yeah, exactly. But both of those things are only issues because of existing discrimination in society, right? Like, if we came from a society that had just the first time seen, two men holding hands or whatever for just a couple walking down the road and not try to attack them for it, we would not have this issue because it wouldn't have been turned into a political question of society. It would just be something that's in society. So the only reason that there's a threat to rights with, like the only reason there'd be a perceived threat to rights is because there's an entire industry that has a concerted effort to try and make it into a battleground. I also don't think there's many, obviously there's some, but there's not really like a huge wave of like transgender, births, right? Like there's
no,
like,
it's not. No, yeah,
like,
no, but that was just like the main point was that like in order to get to where gay people do have full rights to have our families the way we want to, then we need to have these rigid definition of homosexuality. And I don't agree that like these labels are social. I think these labels are just biological, because they describe like things of biological sex and nature. Reproductive biology is what biological sex is, and that is what like many of these societal expectations comes from, that people discriminate based on the sex. That's why people say men do this, women do this, when the only thing that actually defines that is the biology, and there's a huge variance within the female sex. Like what I said, as someone being trans is a perfect example of how different a female can be. Like, so therefore, in order to get to where, it's not really helpful if trans advocacy, which can be a good thing, saying it's always bad. You should do that, but like whenever people want to like go into like the biological definition of homosexuality in cases where we don't actually have these like rights protection, or where even when we do, that is, the definitions are part of the law to protect us, and they kind of like can't change it for that reason, and it doesn't really. And trans people doesn't need that to change to be accepted. They are accepted in their own right.
But then that's the other thing, isn't it? Because I think, as lovely as it would be for us to be in a society where trans people are just, accepted by majority of people, and it's just like a small group who aren't, like, unfortunately, at the moment, there's a massive concerted effort from various state governments to destroy the rights of trans people, and to not even just destroy, to actively eradicate them from society, as we're seeing in America at the moment. And that's not hyperbole. That's literally the US government, for instance, stripped all mention of transgender people from their state websites. They've removed their mention of them in schools and in various job discrimination listings and all that sort of stuff. They've actively tried to, and are trying to, stop all mention of transgender stuff. And so when we're talking about trans advocacy and stuff, and what is effective, I think it's very important to identify that the same people that are trying to be really rigid about what a transgender person is and what they're not and stuff, is also trying to get rid of their rights, and is trying to then do the same thing to other marginalized groups. Like, it's no coincidence that you look at, like, for instance, the Heritage Foundation, right?
I don't like them.
Awful, who does, right? Awful group. But they pour millions into their anti-trans advertising, activism, all of that. And they'll do this, and they also pour millions into their anti-gay stuff, their anti-civil rights stuff in general, right?
The anti-white stuff, the anti-everything.
anti-everything. And so it's really, to me, critical that, and at this moment in particular, because I get what you're saying entirely, right? Like, I think that it's important to understand, like, words mean something for a reason, but equally, we've got to be able to recognize that right now, having a a big societal, or what is the exact meaning of various terms in the LGBTQ category, however you want to describe it, whatever the meaning is, we've got a big problem at the door. The wolves are at the door, right? Like the far right and various other actors in that sphere are in government actively tearing up rights left, right, and centre. And I think that should be the, once we've dealt with them, once that is off in the horizon, like, when there's no person of any sexuality or gender identity under threat from a societal threat, then sure, there's a discussion to be had about what the best labels are and stuff. But right at this moment, I think the reason LGBTQ is such a sort of catch-all term is because there's such an existential threat. And I think that is the bigger picture. And that's not to belittle or demean anyone who feels worried about stuff, but it's just a fact, right? Like, there's people who want everyone in that categorization in a much worse way than they are now.
No, I do see where you're coming from, but like, I would actually argue that like having like very rigid and clear definitions of, well, everything is just how you get more knowledge and how you go forward in society. Like, in order to really defend a group of people, you have to be able to very clearly and consistently define it. That's the best way of advocating and protecting people. And that's why I say that the rights thing, that homosexuality must be defined very rigidly in the law. And I do think that's just to help people. That's why we need to be rigid. And that's to further the right. If I basically said transsexual is somebody who transitioned to present as the opposite sex, I do, and yeah, that's, and I do think that's very good, and like, therefore you have that, and that's consistent, and that's like clear. So therefore you protect people who fit that category because they're transsexual. Yeah, I support that, but it's also like not really my battle to fight, because like I see very little support from the trans group when it comes to advancement for gay people. And I do feel that not most, but some people who claim to be trans activists, but many of them aren't, they're just like weirdos, they're not trans activists or trans people, are actually very much a threat to gay people and lesbian people.
Trans people have always been involved in pride.
Not trans people is not a problem. Like, it's just that, but homosexuality must have our own movement. And many of the things that are about trans people that I might agree are bad isn't actually like something that got to do with me. And there's so many other things that I do think to be way more important. Like, you can do the trans activist crap, but like, to accept that the entire gay population must fall in line and support that, when we know that a lot of significant proportion of people who are transphobic are in fact gay or lesbian, and their homosexuality might be part of the reason why they became like that. I'm not saying that that isn't justification, I'm just saying that it's an explanation. So yeah, I do think it's much better for everybody, for trans people alike, if they get to have their own community and their own advocacy and their own movement, and for people who are gay to have ours, and people who are lesbian to have theirs. Because quite frankly, I do think that sometimes even gay and lesbian people don't get along that well, and sometimes it's actually even better to advocate for them separately, because they
everyone's got their own thing, haven't they? Exactly. No two people are going to be no two people will get along just because they share a characteristic, right? Like, it would be. Go ahead, sorry.
If you basically advocate for ethnic minorities in France, as an example, you can have a Breton, and you can have someone who's black, or somebody who is Franco-Algerian. You can even have someone who's German. They're all an ethnic minority in France, and you can advocate for ethnic minority friends collectively. But the thing is, they still have that specific definition in common, ethnic minority in France. But they're going to have very different issues that they're going to have to face, that you have to be compartmentalized. the same thing goes for people who are disabled. For example, you have somebody who is have different type of disability. One person might just have ADHD, another person might be paralyzed, and a third person might, I don't know, be schizophrenic. Like, yeah, you can still help them all because they're disabled, but like, you're still going to have very different position. And the same thing goes for people who are gay, or people who are lesbian, and people who are bisexual.
Yeah,
they all unite because they are the same in the sexual orientation minority.
So
right?
I think this.
Sorry,
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
And that is valid, but that is a very separate thing from advocacy for an ethnic minority, for a disability, the sexuality, right? These are even though people accept that these things are important and should be advocated for, it's all accepted that not everybody cares about all the three issues equally. And it's also accepted that people aren't forcing them to be under one umbrella. So therefore, I don't agree with, I rather should say, why you have to specifically say sexuality minorities, which are a very varied group with different types of people that are not always going to agree with others, sometimes even be bigoted towards each other. It's not fair that they have to specifically be attached to another type of group that are not organically in the same category.
Yeah, I think I think there's a very interesting point there. So disability, actually, I think is a very similar thing here. So you're absolutely right. ADHD is not the same as dyslexia, which is not the same as autism, which is not the same as etc. Right? They're all separate, different things which affect people in different ways. And it'd be silly to say, oh, it'd be silly to label all of them as exactly the same thing. However, society at various points has deemed all of these people who suffer from, not suffer is the wrong word, all of these people who experience, have exactly, like people who you would categorize in these ways. Society said, oh, you do not fit what a normal human being is, off to the asylum, locked away behind the bars, chained them up in the asylum or whatever, and because of that, all of these groups have essentially been forced to, work together because they are all facing the same ableism, the same the same opposition to neurodivergence. Basically, someone has said, "You are not a normal person." Off to the, wherever the bad people go. And so, even though you're quite right in saying there are different things in society, they bond together through various activist causes because they're fighting the same social discrimination. And for as much as absolutely many of them are quite different, they still, there's still a need to, the person that is going to say, yes, it's wrong that children who find it hard to sit still are then punished for not being able to sit still, is going to be fighting the same battles as a person who says that, the kid that doesn't like loud noises shouldn't be treated like someone who's incompetent and bad because they don't like loud noises. Like, they're fighting a very similar battle. And so similarly, the person who is transgender and saying, actually, I can change my gender, is fighting a similar battle to the person who's saying, I do not have to only marry women or only marry men. I can marry whoever I like, providing we're a consenting adult. But I am looking at the time and we're approaching our 90-minute mark. So perhaps if we head towards our closing bring it to a close, we'll have to do a part 2 at some point. Did you want to come in with a sort of finishing remark? Sorry to cut it slightly short, but
no, that sounds good, because I really need to go to the toilet. Like, I do think that that I don't really agree that the trans cause and the gay cause are, even though they're both valid, I don't think that they are organically connected. But I think we can maybe agree to disagree on that point and then continue this another day, if that makes sense.
Yes, we'll have to do a part 2 at some point. Anyhow, it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been very lovely. It's been a very cordial discussion. Thank you everyone for listening, and yes, at some point I have to tune in for part 2. Thanks again, everyone, and take care all.
Yep. Bye for now.